formed part of a large and continuously changing region. Now, why is this so? I take my cue from the background paper attached to this conference for an answer. I agree with the paper's principal arguments, while at the same time adding more emphasis on elements that were mentioned in passing but not elaborated on at length. The background paper makes two very valid points. The first one concerns the overemphasis in the historiography of the region on political history, to the detriment of other categories such as the social, economic, cultural, or legal. The second point focuses on the alleged absence of sources for the writing of Arab Gulf history. Taken together, these two arguments may explain why present-day histories of the Gulf have practiced a form of selective representation of their own historical traditions, greatly circumscribing the potential and promise of history writing in the region. Let me begin with an example. The first part of the background paper mentions the names of most of the standard Arabic language histories of the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula in the 18th and 19th centuries, and rightly concludes that these historians of the aspiring sheikdoms in Arabia and the Gulf wrote their works on behalf of their patrons, who were often part of or aspiring to become the ruling class. This fact leads most observers to assert that these histories only portrayed the point of view of the patrons and not that of the people of the region. But if you go over these histories with a fine-tooth comb, you will find that despite the support exhibited by first-hand observers such as Ibn Bishr al-Hanbali or Ibn Ghannam or Ibn Sanad for their sheikhly patrons, much of the material of these histories has been glossed over or overlooked by present-day historians themselves. And this is because they are intent on writing chronological histories to support the nationalist project. And what is the national project? From the 1970s until the present, history writing in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula has been focused on sifting and sorting a narrow set of sources to build a nationalist historiography of each individual Gulf state. Unlike the 18th and 19th centuries of Saudi or Qasimi or Al-Khalifa or Al-Thani families, however, some present-day historians seek to discover the origins of their respective states by narrowly focusing only on the ancestry, family pedigree, and descent of their state's ruling elites. The idea is to create a linear chronology of tribes or social groups that are native to each state's governing structure, and to make that genealogical structure unique to the state's identity and character. Thus, they attach significance to the chronologies of rulers, tribal chiefs, and merchants, and view political history as the ultimate form of analysis. According to Professor Nadav Samin, and I quote, "In the Gulf as elsewhere, genealogy is an appealing material for establishing ideological cohesion on the basis of shared heritage. Genealogy and territory are mustered to produce a new kind of history." These attempts to refashion the local histories of each country in the Arab Gulf exist side by side with the creation and propagation of Khaliji identity. This paradigm has now become an all-encompassing, fluid, and multi-dimensional cultural affiliation that complements local nationalisms, relying less on tribal ties as on secular goals of unity, interdependence, and development. Nonetheless, the trend of historiography that tries to support a political nationalist historiography by highlighting local identities bypasses important markers on their way. Returning to the 18th and 19th century histories of pre-modern Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, I myself am astonished by how little present-day historians have picked up from the sometimes quite complex accounts of 18th and 19th century climatological change, tribal maneuvers, and regional interaction. Despite the strictly political histories that have emerged out of the pre-modern corpus, it is worthwhile to note that the historians of the 18th and 19th century recorded many details not only on the Arabian Peninsula or tribal principalities in the Gulf, but on neighboring regions such as Iran and Iraq as well. Some of those details were very immediate and impacted the rise of the first Saudi state or the tribal alliances that came together to pursue long-distance trade. Here, I am not claiming that these 18th and 19th century histories are packed full of insights and revelations that have been bypassed in the pursuit of nationalist historiographies, but I am saying that they should be viewed critically. If one pursues a historiographical project by reading the 18th and 19th century chronicles without a predetermined sense or set point of view, and really sees them in the context of the societies that produced them, then it will become obvious that a political perspective is only one of many interpretations that emerge out of this really rather extraordinary literature. Second, the refrain that there are very little sources from which to write the history of the region is long familiar to students and observers of the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. About 30 years ago, the conviction that Gulf and Arabian history only began with the advent of the British was very common. So the sources available at the British Library, the Public Records Office, and India Office in Britain were considered the chief conduits for research into the region's past. But as the background paper makes clear, oral histories have begun to make their mark. And other sources have been discovered and creatively interpreted that lift the region out of its British influence context and brings it into the wider world. Perhaps the most important development of all, however, is the ushering in of a broader paradigm to tie the Arab Gulf to the larger world outside. Alongside local nationalist genealogical histories and the elaboration of Khaliji identity is the tantalizing, rapidly expanding, and dynamic field of Indian Ocean studies. This burgeoning field is one of the most exciting new historical projects in academia today, and may herald a far broader conceptualization of Gulf history than has previously been attempted. It goes without saying that a wider appreciation of the history of the Gulf, both from an internal perspective as well as from a regional and area-wide standpoint, is absolutely necessary at this point. Ideally, this perspective would be demonstrated in new textual evidence and oral histories, as well as in evidence of linkages with neighboring districts and territories that are at present considered outside the national purview. The historians that have demonstrated this are sometimes from the Gulf itself, but also from the wider Indian Ocean region, as well as from Europe and the United States. One illustrious example is the Kuwaiti professor Fahd Bishara from the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Professor Bishara's first book, A Sea of Debt, established him as one of the most original minds in the field. And the sources that he relied on were revolutionary precisely because they were so commonplace and ordinary. Rather than rely on Arab literary narratives or British consular reports, Professor Bishara traveled from Bahrain to Mumbai in India to Zanzibar, following with a trail of waraqas, legal deeds registering debts for houses, commodities, and services. In doing so, he uncovered one of the most vibrant paper trails in history. These waraqas underpinned all economic activity in the Gulf and Indian Ocean and furnished the substance of the law of the region. And the law was the main instrument that facilitated the expansion of trade, binding actors far away from each other in chains of obligation and credit. This is I'm quoting. As a result of his pioneering study and the work of many other excellent historians, legal history which was one of the most undersubscribed fields in the Arab Gulf and Indian Ocean, is attracting dozens of candidates. In his second book, soon to be published, Professor Bishara uses the logbooks and daily journals of Kuwaiti sea captains to chart the details of oceanic trade from the Arab Gulf to India and back. Meanwhile, another enterprising historian, using different sources than ones customarily used by historians of the Arab Gulf and the Indian Ocean, is the Indian scholar, Professor Johann Matthew, whose book, Margins of the Market, described and analyzed the interdependency of trafficking and the smuggling of contraband on the development of capitalism across the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. Like Professor Bishara, Professor Matthew also used evidence that had hardly been looked at before. He looked at family archives in Dubai, sources in Bombay, and material in Zanzibar, arguing convincingly that smuggling and contraband networks created their own dynamic in the Indian Ocean, which even the British and the local governments were forced to respect. He charts the validity of trade outside the boundaries of official government sanction and explains the different forms that capitalism took in the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. A third historian, the American professor Michael Christopher Lowe, wrote a book called Imperial Mecca, Ottoman Arabia and the Indian Ocean Hajj, using Ottoman, Turkish, and Arabic sources, as well as European material. As he states himself, his book, analyzes how the Hijaz and the steamship-era pilgrimage to Mecca simultaneously became objects of Ottoman modernization, global public health, environmental management, international law, and inter-imperial competition during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the point is, there are sources for the writing of Arab Gulf history, if historians are willing to go beyond the familiar material to be found in governmental archives across the Gulf and the Arab world. These three historians and countless others have described and analyzed the regional networks of trade, transport, law, religion, and culture that tied areas as far apart as Central Arabia to East Africa and Western India and pre-modern Asia. They have shown that in order to contest Western encroachment on the region, these networks devised creative and imaginative strategies to fund and transport goods, capital, and people over a wide area, even in the age of European steamships, telegraph lines, and railways. And as becomes obvious when one reads the material available in this endeavor, Arab Gulf merchants, sea captains, financiers, pilgrims, and sheikhs of different religious orders were key agents in this endeavor. This growing literature is where the gaze of Arab Gulf historians should be directed. If Indian Ocean history were to be amalgamated into the nationalist historiography of the Arab Gulf region, then that larger framework would revitalize the study of history at universities all over the Arab Gulf. And so this is my different paradigm. I would like to propose that Arab Gulf history immerse itself in the broader expanse of Indian Ocean studies because it has the world to gain and nothing to lose by joining in the exploration of a common past. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا دكتورة هالة على هذه المداخلة المهمة، وأنتقل إلى الدكتور فهد بشارة، بتأمل أنه معنا الآن. الدكتور فهد هو أستاذ مشارك في قسم التاريخ بجامعة فيرجينيا في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، حاصل على الدكتوراه في التاريخ من جامعة ديوك بولاية كارولاينا الشمالية عام 2014، وعلى الماجستير في دراسات الخليج العربي من جامعة إكستر في المملكة المتحدة عام 2006. تتركز اهتماماته البحثية في التاريخ القانوني وتاريخ الرأسمالية في العالم الإسلامي في المقام الأول وخارجه عموماً. صدر له بحر من الديون القانون والحياة الاقتصادية في غرب المحيط الهندي من 1780 ل 1950 عام 2017، والذي حاز على جائزة جيمس ويلارد هيرست من جامعة القانون والمجتمع في الولايات المتحدة، وجائزة جيري بنتلي من جامعة التاريخ العالمي، وجائزة بيتر جونيفلستاين للكتاب من الجامعة الأمريكية للتاريخ القانوني. دكتور فهد تفضل.
دام فضلكم وشكرا. عفوا، أنا كتبت البحث باللغة الإنجليزية ولكني مستعد أن أجاوب على أسئلة في العربي. Thank you to everybody for being here. I'm really happy for the opportunity to share my work with this community. And thank you to Hala for stimulating paper and excellent set of questions. Hala, you know I'm deeply indebted to you and an enormous fan of your work and you personally. So it's an honor to be on a panel with you. My talk proceeds from two very basic questions at its premise. Where do we locate the history of the Gulf and how might we write it? For a long time, the answer had been to locate the Gulf in the Middle East. And there we go, sorry. The problem with the paradigm of thinking of the Gulf as part of the Middle East, which is, I mean, it's not incorrect, but it's limiting, precisely because the pre-oil Gulf had not a whole lot to do with places like Baghdad, Beirut, and Cairo. Of course, there was some connection to these places. And for decades, the Gulf has been relegated to the sidelines, to the margins of a narrative of Middle Eastern history that principally played out in places like Iraq, Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman Empire and post-Ottoman societies, we might say. Seen from that perspective, the perspective of Middle Eastern studies and Middle Eastern history, the Gulf often just does not appear to be very important. It's peripheral to the narrative of the pre-modern and modern Middle East until the rise of oil. But what if we imagined the Gulf history principally to connect to places elsewhere? Places like Bombay, Karachi, Calicut, Zanzibar, and Aden. What new histories does that bring to light? What new processes does it suggest? What new questions and materials might it bring to light? For years now, I've been arguing that we ought to think of the Gulf as part of the Indian Ocean. And I'm glad to say I'm no longer alone in this endeavor. There are many people, many of whom Hala already mentioned, but might add some up-and-coming scholars from the Gulf, Ahmed al-Mazmi, who's doing outstanding work in Indian Ocean history and thinking about the connections between the Arabian Peninsula and Indian Ocean, and then many others, of course. What does it mean to think about the Gulf as part of the Indian Ocean? What does it mean to think of the Indian Ocean anyway? At the simplest level, it's to suggest that we think about oceans as spaces that connect societies rather than separate them. At its premise, Indian Ocean history asks us to think about how we divide up the world around us. Do we divide it up by territorial continents? Do we think in terms of the Middle East or Africa or Asia? Or can we think about the spaces that connect these land masses together? Once we do that, then we can begin to think of, once we think in terms of connection, I should say, we can begin to think of the communities and goods and ideas and political formations and all sorts of historical processes that have been left out of our land-based view. If we read the history of the Gulf from the sea rather than the land, we can reposition the region. We can open up new periodizations, new fruitful avenues of historical inquiry, new readings of old sources, new sources, and think through questions of circulation, connection, entanglement. We might think of a history of the Gulf in which the past is scattered along a vast littoral coast and woven into a much broader transregional fabric, one that refuses to retrofit the Gulf's past into the national narratives that have dominated Gulf history writing. It's hard to know where to begin telling the history of Gulf traders in the Indian Ocean, and trade is often the easiest way of thinking about these. And I'll be getting to the question of sources soon. As you can see, there are lots of sources actually for thinking about the history of the Gulf. So there's evidence of a maritime trade, of course, between the Gulf and India that goes back thousands of years, even in more modern guises. There's the medieval trade with the Indian Ocean, the expansion of Omani trade in India and East Africa from the 1600s onwards, and a whole lot more. For the Northern Gulf, the modern history is a little bit more recent. We might date the rise of Northern Gulf traders in the Indian Ocean to the mid-1700s, after the establishment of Utubi states in Kuwait, Bahrain, Zubara. By the early 19th century, at least, we have evidence of inhabitants of Kuwait and other places in the Gulf accumulating landholdings in Basra, which formed much of their resource base. From Basra, they produced the dates that they would sell around the Indian Ocean alongside the pearls they fished from around the Gulf. By the 1820s, we're already having reports of Gulf traders around the coasts of Sindh and Gujarat and Malabar and Bombay, and then dhows from Ras Al Khaimah and other places calling at Malabar for shipbuilding timber. By the second half of the 19th century, inhabitants of the Northern Gulf were setting up business offices in India. Merchants from Basra had been doing this as early as the 18th century, of course, in places like Surat. And this is, Hala Fattah had pointed this out decades ago, way before her time. And then as more Gulf traders accumulated landholdings around the Shat al-Arab, they also sought out trading partners in India and eventually ended up sending their own family members over there as well. By the late 19th century, we have lots of different Gulf trading offices up and down the west coast of India, but clustered around a few nodes, Karachi and Bombay, and later in Calicut. And then they have relationships with merchants and brokers in Gujarat, Goa, Mangalore, Kochi, and they're all we might think of them all as a transoceanic commercial society through which goods, credit, and information circulate. And this is really the subject of the book that I've been working on, which Hala very kindly previewed. By that time, by the late 19th, early 20th century, virtually all of the sheikdoms of the Gulf had entered into treaty relationships with the government of India. The Gulf rulers signed over the defense and foreign relations to the British Raj, and at the same time, Gulf traders fanned out into British-held ports. Again, they clustered around a few main ports, Karachi and Bombay mostly, which formed part of the Bombay presidency, I should say, and then later Calicut. And then they also made their way to Aden, which, as you'd see on the map here and through all of the material that we have, we know that Aden is also part of the Bombay presidency. Some end up on the Swahili coast. Some traders from the Northern Gulf end up on the Swahili coast, but not very many. That trade was dominated by merchants from Oman, Gujarat, and Kuwaiti Nawakhida ship captains visited places like Mombasa and Zanzibar with some frequency, and Gulf traders in Aden did business with East Africa and the Horn of Africa as well. But for various reasons, they chose not to establish business offices there and instead focused their energies on the possessions of the British Raj in the Western Indian Ocean. Part of that is because of the access of British political offices in Indian ports. They could tap into the legal and diplomatic infrastructure that would facilitate the movement of money and obligations between the Gulf and Indian Ocean, and they often make use of courts and other legal facilities. But the process might also have been motivated by a desire to take advantage of the technologies of empire and colonial capitalism in the region. We often think of colonial capitalism and capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula as being separate from one another, but they're not. The Gulf merchants accessed and made use of an infrastructure of communications, finance, transportation. They made use of technologies like the telegraph, very, very frequently made use of the telegraph to communicate prices and orders. They made use of steamships. They established their own steamship companies as well. And they all held accounts in British banks in India. To tell my story in this book, or to tell this story in my book, I draw on three collections. I have it over here mostly, but I'll show some more. There's the business archive of Muhammad bin Abdullah al-Matrouk, whom we see in this picture, and he's a Kuwaiti trader that's based out of Basra, and the family collection is just fantastic. Lots and lots of different kinds of materials. There's also letters addressed to Hussein or Abdurrahman bin Hussein al-Asrusi from Kuwait, who has family members traveling up and down the Indian coast. And then there's the extensive correspondence of Muhammad Salim Sderawi over here, who's a Kuwaiti trader and banker based out of Bombay in the early 20th century. And the family collection includes something like 15,000 letters addressed to Sderawi all over a 5 or 6 year period. Together, these people helped me map out the world of Gulf trade, the different instruments, letters, accounts, the move between them, their interactions with the British Indian legal system, etc. We get a network level view of this world, and that's incredibly useful. And in most work, it's largely missing. Hala, again, was one of the first to talk about this. And then there are others that followed, of course, Muhammad al-Bakr, who wrote about Oman and Zanzibar, but not very many others in the Gulf, although there are more and more young historians, Muhammad al-Habib being one of them, who are writing using these materials. But I want us to think about this world from the perspective of one of these individuals, just one, from the micro level. My original plan was to talk about Matruk and his world in Basra, but at the last minute, I ended up deciding to write about, or to give my presentation on somebody else. But before I shift to that, let me say a quick word about what I mean by thinking about the micro level. What I'm talking about here is what historians called for decades now, microhistory. Microhistory, what is microhistory? Well, at its core, microhistory is a historical method or sensibility that focuses on writing at the small scale. It focuses on, it writes about very micro level phenomenon. It reduces the scale of analysis, but uses that to take on much bigger issues. And so microhistorians are always thinking about larger processes, larger conceptual categories, larger analytical frameworks, but they ground it in more micro level material. And in doing so, it helps us grapple with the source material itself, the clues that actors left behind in the source material through marginalia, through errors, through other means, but also lets us think about the limits of the sources themselves. So rather than think about sources simply as windows onto the past or sources of data, we might think of sources as being produced in an historical moment, and microhistory is very good at thinking about that. And microhistory is it's good for all sorts of reasons, but it's especially useful for writing the history of the Gulf and Indian Ocean. We have lots of sources for the history of the Gulf, actually. There's no shortage of material, and it used to be that we used to think that there was not very much local material for writing the history. I think at this point that is no longer. It's no longer the case. We can no longer keep up the fiction that there are no sources for writing the history of the region. It's just categorically untrue. In fact, we have too many local sources for writing the history of the region. The question is, what do we do with them? And we have lots of sources that lend themselves especially well for microhistory. Some of them are written by elites, some of the court historians that you've already heard about today, others written by more marginal figures. And the Kuwaiti historian Abdurrahman Ibrahim has done an excellent job of inviting us all to think about Tarikh al-Mutahamish, the sort of marginal history, which I think is akin to microhistory in many ways. But also, we through this framework, we can, through a microhistorical approach, we can think more deeply about the categories, the concepts, the processes that we associate with Gulf history. So I'll spend the rest of the presentation talking about one particular source, the notebook of the Kuwaiti Nokhida Abdul Majid al-Farijawi, this handsome man you see in front of you over here, and his collection, which is in a Malabar teak chest, Sandub Nebari, in a suburban neighborhood in Kuwait. The notebook, which you see on the left, belongs to Abdul Majid al-Farijawi, As the family name suggests, he lived on the island of Felice off the coast of Kuwait. Although the Nukhida himself tells us in his notebook that his family came to Felice from Kharij Island off the coast of Iran when he was very young. None of you will know about the Nukhida Abdul Majid, and you shouldn't know about the Nukhida Abdul Majid. Even among the sort of the pantheon of Nawakhida in the Gulf, Al-Felichawi was not the most famous at all. He didn't undertake any extraordinary voyages. He traveled the same routes as almost all other Nawakhida from Kuwait did. He did not write any treatises like some of the other Nawakhida in the Gulf. All we have is this notebook, which is in some ways pretty ordinary, but in other respects very extraordinary. In some respects, he's a perfect candidate for a good micro-level perspective on this world. He's a very peripheral, marginal figure, but one whose life and movements actually tell us a lot about how the Indian Ocean world, the connections between the Gulf and Indian Ocean world worked. He helps us tell a big story from a small place. Remember, that's the point of microhistory, is you focus in on something that's very manageable and graspable, but then you try to blow it up into something much larger. So let's start with his notebook. It contained a log of a voyage that the Nukhida took. Actually, there are 3 different notebooks, I should say, all of which contained logs of the voyages. They're principally logbooks, what the Nawakhida called the Roznama. But there is a lot more to the Roznama than the log of the voyage itself. When I first opened up, or I should say, this is what a typical, the sort of the Roznama looks like on the inside. It's entries of different days on the voyage, observations on wind, weather patterns, location, things like that. Actually, it's in many ways it's a really, really boring source. It's very routine and dry. But there are all sorts of interesting things that happen in there. So when I first opened up the logbook, the first thing that leaped out at me were the notes that the Nukhida had inscribed into the thing. And this is the colophon up here where he identifies himself and gives a brief history of his family. But there were also two inscribed contracts for debts taken by individuals with varying combinations of the names Hassan, Ali, Muhammad, and Ahmed. All of these both of these contracts were entered into in the same year, 1924, the same year that Felichawi came to own the notebook. They're not the only ones. Inside the notebook were lots of other contracts covering all sorts of different situations. Acknowledgements of debt linked specifically to particular commodities, rice. Several contracts for loading and freighting dates, which was the principal cargo that Felichawi and other Nukhidas carried at the time. And then there were what we might call money orders, hawalas, requests from one person to transfer money over to another port city. What struck me about these documents was how much they mapped onto a world of documents out in the marketplace, punctuating virtually every moment in the movement of the Dow from the Gulf around the Western Indian Ocean. There were different financial and legal instruments, contracts, notes, orders, receipts, accounts in Arabic, Persian, Gujarati, English, and so on, often 2 or 3 of these at once. We see these scattered across different private archives, collections, museums around the Gulf. Transactional ephemera, everybody in this room has probably seen something like this. Transactional ephemera, when we read them on their own and disconnected from one another, they're very difficult to make any sense of. When we connect them to one another, we read them alongside one another, we can see the documentary infrastructure of the marketplace, of what I call the bazaar, come to be. And this is how we ought to read these, as instruments that circulated between merchants and moved alongside letters, telegraphs, and other materials. But the contracts that Felichawi enters into his notebook are not actual contracts. Actually, they're model contracts. They're templates for contracts. In some of them, the contracting parties are referred to as Fulan bin Fulan. And in others, he actually marks out that he says that this is a model for hawala, a model for date transport contract. These force us to come to the terms of the process of thinking and learning about contractual forms and law. by stripping them of the elements that give them legal force, but retaining the formulas that give them their shape. Al-Faydachawi opened up the possibility of reanimating the documents, of utilizing them whenever he needed to. This is not static legal knowledge. It moves from one person to another around the shores of the Western Indian Ocean on the deck of the dhow. This is legal thinking in motion, moving out from the world of contracts onto the page of the notebook and back out again. I should say also that there's very strong reason to believe that this is not Al-Faydachawi's handwriting at all. Actually, it doesn't match with the rest of the handwriting in the logs. It matches more closely with the handwriting of his teacher, who would later become his father-in-law, the Nokhida Mansour al-Khariji. And so we're seeing a process of instruction as well. And there are lots of other moments like this. Alongside notes on contracting were lots of notes on navigation, more notes on navigation than on contracting, actually. He lays out different principles for navigation, inscribes different data points. Some of these actively reference other authors. Over here, the one on the far right, that I think my picture is probably blocking. No, it's not. It's only blocking it on mine. But over here on the far right is one that references the famous navigator Ahmed bin Majid, who authored the Kitab al-Fawaid. And then there are lots of other notes that he seems to have cribbed from other texts. So we might think of these as part of the conceptual and textual universe within which the Tao moved. Through his notes, we see Al-Faydachawi's engagement with a literary tradition, one that includes writings by other Nawakhida, of course. Over the course of the 19th and 20th century, Nawakhida from around the Gulf produced writing on different aspects of navigation around the Indian Ocean. They produced sailing manuals, nautical almanacs, manuals for weighing and valuing pearls, on managing accounts. Some of these are long treatises, others are very short pamphlets. They write in a mixture of poetry and prose. The most famous, I should say the most famous from Kuwait at least, is the Nokhida Isa al-Gitami, whose Dalil al-Muhtar fi Ilm al-Bihar was published in 1917 and was very widely read and widely cited and engaged with by other Nawakhida. Al-Gitami is a fascinating character, Nawakhida, and an intellectual. He writes all sorts of different texts. He even writes a treatise, or I should say, he writes a history of Oman, though that manuscript has been lost. What I'm gesturing to here is a history of ideas coming out of this sea of text that move alongside the Tao. Rather than think of these as individual publications, which we often do, we might think of them as forming a corpus of writing in and on the sea, and texts of writing that are texts that are in conversation with one another. Al-Faydachawi actively reads these. He reads Al-Gitami, Ibn Majid, he consumes them, copies principles and data from them. He renders that knowledge portable. It's a part of the itinerary, together with the contract. It's part of the infrastructure of circulation. It's through reading these together that we begin to think of navigational. We begin to see Al-Faydachawi not just as a Nokhida, but as somebody who is reading and thinking and reflecting on his world and tapping into shared conventions and tapping into a history of ideas as he's moving around the Indian Ocean. There's also lots of other things that he's doing in the notebook. There's a whole series of mathematical conversions. Some of these relate to questions of navigation, how to derive longitude from latitude, latitude from departure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then also lots of them involve transactions, conversions between different measurements for baskets of dates, conversions between different currencies, how to measure timber and how to abstract a value out of timber. And all of these, he's relying on different mathematical principles, which allows him to create commensurability across different marketplaces in the Indian Ocean. Ultimately allows him to forge a path through which capital in its different forms can circulate around the maritime bazaar. There's a lot more that I can say. I'm running out of time and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. There are also maps that he has, that he annotates, and they're incredibly fascinating. when I saw these materials, I was struck by how rich they were, how much they told me about a person and a life that I didn't know at all. I was also struck by how little they had to tell us about the place where I found them, in Kuwait. As rich as the material is, none of it suggests itself as a candidate for a national history. Although we see these kinds of artifacts all over the country, they're seldom told as part of the nation. They're materials that have been pushed to the margins of a national narrative that is formed in dry land. Actually, there's no real place for them in a national narrative. They involve known individuals and families, of course, but they also involve communities, places, and processes that fall well outside of the territorial nation state. But in many ways, that might just be a matter of perspective. Read as artifacts or materials for Indian Ocean history, they become quite central, actually. Part of the appeal that Indian Ocean has for me, as someone invested in the history of the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula, is that it breaks down the boundaries between these geographical containers and allows us the freedom to roam. But it's more than just new geographies and new connections that emerge. With these come new processes and temporalities from which to consider the history of the Gulf. Actually, as we think of it as part of an Indian Ocean history, we're able to better embed the Gulf in processes of world history, histories of transregional trade, empire, industrialization, law, capitalism, and global intellectual history, to name just a few that reflect my own interests. Rather than think of the Gulf as a weak appendage to a terrestrial Middle Eastern history that's centered on the Ottoman Empire and post-Ottoman societies, we can begin to see the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula as forming a central part of an exciting conversation on Indian Ocean history. And we are better able to make sense of the Gulf's pre-oil past. Although historians in the Gulf care about the maritime history of the Gulf, there's not much engagement with the oceanic history of the Gulf. There are ships, but there are no transregional connections. There are no societies abroad. And arguably, without an oceanic framework, things like the Dow, which is a celebrated icon across the Gulf, is an empty signifier. Without an Indian Ocean history, we run the risk of becoming tourists to our own past. What I've presented today is an experiment in oceanic microhistory on an Indian Ocean scale. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But through sort of microhistorical approach, we're able to speak about much larger processes, to grasp the processes by which individuals navigated a much broader world. Through El-Felichawi's travels and writings, we open a vista onto at least some of the processes that conjured up a transregional world. If these are scattered histories, it's by moving that we can gather what's been scattered. I've given us one slice here, one thread, one movement through this world. There are hundreds more that I could have followed, thousands more arrows pointing lots of different ways between the Gulf and Indian Ocean world. I've chosen to tell you about an ordinary nokhida, an ordinary set of materials, extraordinary in many ways, all to cast light on much broader processes and to ask bigger questions about where we locate the history of the Gulf, and again, how we might write it. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور فهد على المداخلة المهمة، ونفتح النقاش، المجال للنقاش والأسئلة. تفضل دكتور.
Many thanks to both presenters. There are many details that escape me, but I would like to perhaps say something about the wider picture. First of all, let us agree on certain fundamental ideas regarding history. I think by now we can more or less agree intellectually that there is no history in itself. You know, it's not that there is a history in itself and we are constantly unearthing it. What we have is always recontextualization and reinterpretation. Now, I noticed, for example, there is an overemphasis on the question of documents and how central that you will have documents, and there are perhaps some neglected documents that now we have to look into more closely, etc. But documents are not really the main ways of reinterpreting history. We interpret history because now we have certain tools, analytical tools, that were not available before, which allow us to understand the past in a way different from a generation before. Think about how psychoanalysis, for example, when it came out, it very much reoriented the whole idea of writing history in many ways, or economic history, etc. I mean, until today, let me give you an example. Until today, there are books and texts produced on the French Revolution. Why? The French Revolution happened in daylight, and it's not because of an unearthing of a new documents, but because we have a new theoretical interpretive grids that were not available before. So the issue of reading our past is also an issue of a theoretical importance, first of all, and not simply of uncovering or discovering new documents. That's one thing. The other one is this. I mean, why do we need history? Why do we need to go and write and read history or invest efforts in history? Now, Friedrich Nietzsche has an answer to this. Nietzsche says that in his view, there are three types of history. There is the antiquarian history, where people go and try to reach knowledge for knowledge's sake. So they split hairs on details, etc., etc., which is for him, and I would agree, it's really a waste of time. You know, it's a kind of the antiquarian history. And there is the monumental history, where you go to the past in order to see certain kind of inspiring figures, monuments that helps you in the present. And I think that has its uses, definitely. We need always inspiring figures from the past. There is nothing wrong about that. And there is what he calls critical history. That is to say, people present certain things as being natural, and we historicize them. We show them that they are historical, they are product of a certain circumstances, and this way, if we can deal with them better. If you say something is a product of nature, then you either has to accept it or reject it. But if you say it's a part of history, it means that there are certain conditions that produced it, and by changing the conditions, you change that thing. And I think here, the Arab culture is most in need, not of more historical knowledge, but to acquire what Abdullah al-Arawi, the famous Moroccan thinker, called historical sense. The idea that we do not historicize things enough. You know, not that we don't know about history, but we don't see things as being a product of circumstances rather than something that are there by nature. Because in the end, and I'll finish with that, history is not a question of facts as positivism thing. It's a question of sense, a question of meaning, not facts. What are the meaning of these facts? This is the context of proper history. And meaning is always open, because there are different perspectives to look at the same fact. There are different tools to throw on the same facts, etc., etc. Thank you.
شكرا دكتور. بروفيسور أورليكي.
Thank you very much for these presentations, which I very much appreciate, because I've also been quite invested in this project of Indian Ocean history and seeing the peninsula as part of this. I appreciate that Fahd pointed out the long history of these connections, which are, of course, even pre-Islamic, etc. Nevertheless, I think we need to recognize that the large expansion of Indian Ocean trade was very much linked to the imperial project, to the East India Company, precisely. And I think that is, which is also one of the reasons why I guess it has been, I mean, why on the one hand, Indian Ocean trade, in a sense, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, did not collapse, but shrank. And the connections were very often cut, at least for a long period of time. And I mean, I think it, with regard to the peninsula, the Radd al-Fa'al, the reaction is also that, you know, there's this return to tribal rather than, if you like, cosmopolitan or international connections. If you want to, if you discuss the hawiyya, the identity. And I think this is something which would need to be probably discussed quite openly in order to perhaps overcome also some of these restrictions. I mean, coming back to my own case study of Jeddah, there's something similar happening where historically the cosmopolitanism is very much embraced, but for the present period, I mean, we've discussed on the margins of this conference, you know, there are hashtags like Hawiyat al-Hijaz. Are these people who immigrated, are they actually part of our Hijazi and Saudi society or not? So I think similar things have been described by James Onley and others for the Gulf. So I think this is something which would need to be discussed, because as long as history is considered to be a nation-building project, this history is quite actively written out of Gulf history.
شكرا شكرا هلا وشكرا فهد. فهد welcome to Doha. إن شاء الله next year بتكون معنا هون. يعني تعليق، معلش بدي أحكي بالعربي مش لأنه أسهل بس مشان الحضور كمان. تعليقي كمان مرتبط شوي باللي عم تحكي أولريكا. فهد، أنا وياك كان في هيدي الكونفرزيشن بيناتنا من حوالي 3 سنين لما عبد الرزاق جمعنا خلال كورونا على مواضيع بتخص الخليج. مثل ما بتعرف يعني أنا كنت من أول اللي حكوا بموضوع اللينكس بين عمان تحديداً والمحيط الهندي، ولكن بدي أشوف شو رأيك بالتالي إنه التركيز حصرياً مثل ما عم تعمل على المحيط الهندي، يعني سياق الخليج والمحيط الهندي بينفع أكتر لما عم نحكي عن تريد. بس مثلاً بشغل اللي أنا اشتغلته اللي كان مور intellectual history صعب تحصره بالمحيط الهندي. يعني طبعاً هذا يعني كمان بيلتقي مع اللي عم تقوله أولريكا، إنه عندك لما نجي لمسألة تستخدم اللغة العربية أو قصص التراث الهوية وأمور أخرى بتتشعب يعني العلاقات. المحيط الهندي بيكون جزء منها، ولكن لابد من يعني ضم مناطق أخرى في التحليل التاريخي في سياق مثلا التاريخ الفكري. ما فينا نستبعد نطاق العربي إن كان أوتومان ليت أوتومان ولا بوست أوتومان. وطبعا يعني أنا بعرف كمان لما نقول إنديان أوشن في قسم من أفريقيا داخل فيها، بس كمان يعني بشكل عام بتوسع أكتر النطاق الأفريقي لدراسة هذه العلاقات من خلال التاريخ الفكري. شكرا.
تفضل.
شكرا جزيلا للدكتور فهد وللدكتورة هالة. أنا فقط سؤالي للدكتور فهد هو تواصلا مع مداخلة وسؤال الدكتورة أمل، هو المشتركات التي تجمعنا في المحيط الهندي بالنسبة للتاريخ العربي. ما هي المشتركات الثقافية؟ هل في لغة، في تأثير على المناطق؟ يعني هل في تأثير آخر غير التجارة، موضوع التجارة وتبادل السلع، وأيضا التجارة بمفهومها المحدود جدا هو تبادل السلع أو نقل السلع، وأحيانا يكون تجارة ترانزيت فقط، يعني نقل سلعة من ميناء إلى ميناء. لكن ماذا عن التاريخ الثقافي، التاريخ الاجتماعي، التاريخ السياسي، التأثير السياسي أيضا في ذلك؟ النقطة الثانية هو موضوع الاستعمار. إلى أي مدى تاريخ المحيط الهندي أو مؤرخو المحيط الهندي يولون هذه الأهمية في موضوع الاستعمار البريطاني وتأثيره في المنطقة العربية، منطقة الجزيرة بتنوعاتها المختلفة. أريد أسمع من الدكتور فهد وجهة نظره، وهو الاسم اللامع في هذا التخصص الآن. شكرا.
أعطي المجال مجددا للدكتورة هالة والدكتور فهد. ما في أسئلة. دكتورة هالة.
Okay, so I'd like
to
to answer your question. I agree with you that history is not only about documents, it's about interpreting documents, and it's not about facts. And one of the things that I most enjoyed was conducting an oral history program for over 10 years. I was, right after the 2003 war, I began to conduct an oral history program with Iraqis coming outside of Iraq to Jordan. I must have talked to about 60 or 70 people, and really what they told me you can't find in books. And it's really delightful to be able to listen to these reminiscences and memories. So I agree with you. History is a very fluid subject. It's not something that can be only tied to a certain thing or an ideology. And I go to Dr. Ulrika. I don't think that history should be a nation-building sort of instrument. No. In fact, I want to liberate it from this. And I want to say, yeah. So I totally agree with your point. For Dr. Fahed?
Thank you. The question of why history is an important question, and it's not one we're going to resolve today, but part of why we do history is to become more globally minded citizens and human beings, also to push against the received narratives of the past. And I don't think that, like Hala, I don't think that materials and frameworks are mutually exclusive. It's not an either-or situation, and it should never be one. Even if you're coming up with new frameworks for writing the past, you need to be able to ground it in something. And that doesn't mean that the material that you have to ground it in is new, but there needs to be some empirical grounding. Part of the critique that emerged of cultural history, for example, was that it was not as empirically grounded, and that's been corrected, of course. So frameworks and materials are not mutually exclusive. I think the emphasis on sources that Hala and I have been making over the course of our presentations is not to say that sources are the be-all and end-all, but rather that we do have materials for writing the history of the region, and we ought to be able to take these materials seriously, and we ought to be able to think about the kinds of questions that we can ask of these materials, and not just ignore them and say, well, what do we really need are frameworks? Sure, we can have frameworks as well, and nobody would deny that, but frameworks for interpreting what exactly? Ulrika, I appreciate your questions and your provocations. The question of the trade expanding with the history of empire is sure, yes. I think that we can think of imperial projects in the Indian Ocean, Arab imperial projects, maybe the Omani imperial project being one of them, as being intertwined with the histories of the East India Company and the British Empire and British Raj as well. It's not an either or here. Again, we don't need to think of these as being separate processes from one another. The beauty of Indian Ocean history is it allows us to think of these together. That local, political, and commercial projects and what we might think of as colonial or imperial ones are intertwined with one another. And in terms of the kinds of the discourses of nativism that you're talking about, That's precisely where Indian Ocean history is actually helpful, as you know. Indian Ocean history is very useful for decentering these ethnocentric discourses and combating them and historicizing them. It allows us to see when and why these sorts of discourses of nativism emerge. I'm thinking here maybe the work of Jonathan Glassman, Sana Ayar, others can point us to some answers. These are mostly in East Africa, of course, but they raise important questions for us as well. Amal, of course, Indian Ocean history and the history of trade are often synonymous with one another. I don't think of the histories of trade and the histories of ideas as being separate from one another. They don't have to be separate from one another. They feed off of one another. But Amal, I should point out, and you probably know this, that in the last 10 or 15 years, I would say the bulk of the work that's come out on Indian Ocean history has not been in the history of trade, but has been in intellectual history. We have lots of work. I can think of, Jyoti Balachandran, Christopher Paul, Eng Seng Ho, lots of others, Shireen Hamza, lots of others that are spanning lots of different periods that are actually mostly about ideas, the histories of ideas and intellectual histories rather than the history of trade. Trade is always there in the background, but that's not the central question that they are asking. As for the last question, I believe it's Dr. Saeed. There's, is there more than trade? Again, to refer to my answer to Emma, there's intellectual history, there's the history of empires, there's histories of family. We are at the precipice of lots of excellent work on the histories of family, work on decolonization and disconnection in the Indian Ocean and the impact that it's had on different families, histories of the state, histories of, there are lots of different approaches. As for what to do with the histories of colonialism, I think this is where historians of the Arabian Peninsula really need to interrogate that history a little bit more closely. Historians of India, historians of East Africa have done an excellent job. Historians of Southeast Asia, I should say, also have done an excellent job of thinking about the histories of empire and colonialism, and those are not the same thing at all. And what the histories of empire and colonialism in those places might look like, and how we can think of a more critical history of colonialism. It's just not the case that we've had very much of that in the Gulf. Now, of course, there has been some excellent work. Dr. Abdulrazak Tikriti being among them, but also Amar Shahabi and others are moving us towards a more critical history of colonialism in the Gulf. But I have to say that we have much longer to go. And part of the reason that we have sort of struggled in thinking through these questions is because it's not clear what the parallel examples that we are thinking of are. If we are trying to think of the Gulf within the framework of Middle Eastern history, the colonial experiences just don't map onto one another in the same way, and they don't generate very good questions for us, and they lead us to believe that the Gulf is just somehow different. But once we think of the Gulf as part of the Indian Ocean and we see what the colonial histories of places like East Africa or India, less so India, Southeast Asia look like, then we can begin to ask excellent questions of the histories of colonialism, and actually, even more than colonialism, think of better histories of decolonization in the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula.
شكرا دكتور فهد. ما في هون، ما في. اوكي، اتقدم بالشكر الجزيل مجددا للدكتوره هالة والدكتور فهد والحضور الكريم على تفاعلكم في هذه الجلسه، واشكر كل من شارك معنا في هذه الندوه من باحثين ومؤرخين، وعلى امل ان نرى هذه الأعمال على صفحات دورية أسطور قريباً. أدعو الدكتور حيدر سعيد لإلقاء بضع كلمات لاختتام أعمال المنتدى وأعمال ندوة أسطور. تفضل دكتور.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا بالحقيقة ما عندي شيء. البارحة تقريبا احنا اختتمنا يعني بعد 3 أيام متعبة. أنا شخصيا تعبت. فشكرا جزيلا. أنا أعتقد اليوم الثالث كان يوم مهم وحافل. الأوراق اللي سمعناها حوالي 10 أوراق في تقييم تجربة الكتابة التاريخية في بلدان الخليج، يعني مهمة. والجلسة الأخيرة بالفعل، وهذا الجدل اللي يطرح حول قصة تاريخ الخليج من فضاء المحيط الهندي، علاقاته وصلاته بالعالم العربي والمشرق العربي، الصلات هي ثقافية وتجارة أم صلات سياسية وما إلى ذلك. وأعتقد سيستمر يعني. ولا أخفيكم أنه المركز مخطط في الوحدة مخططة في 2025 أنه تعقد مؤتمر عن تاريخ الخليج في فضاء المحيط الهندي. 2024 راح نعقد مؤتمر في أكتوبر عن تاريخ الساحل الشرقي للخليج، طبيعة التركيبة الإثنية والتبادلات والشبكات مع الساحل الغربي. يبقى أملنا أنه نقرأ الأوراق في عدد خاص من دورية أسطور، وكذلك الأمل بأنه بين أوراق المسارين في اليومين السابقين، مسار علاقات دول الخليج بالصين ومسار السياسات الثقافية في بلدان الخليج، أن تصدر في كتابين مستقلين، وهذا يوسع ويثري المكتبة الخليجية، وهذا هدفنا. إلى الملتقى. شكرا لحضوركم. شكرا لكل شكرا لتجشمكم عناء القدوم إلى الدوحة. شكرا لكل الزملاء الذين أسهموا في هذه الفعاليات. يعني أنا تحديدا أريد أذكر يارا نصار، سجد طرمان، زملائي الأعزاء، وإبراهيم عبد الجواد، وفيصل ساولي، وعامر سعد، وكذلك معتز الناظر، ونغم العقاد. وإلى الملتقى. شكرا. وإلى الملتقى في الدورة 11 من منتدى دراسات الخليج. سيعلن عن الموضوعين في وقت لاحق، وسنبقى في نفس الإطار، موضوع عن العلاقات الدولية الخليج، وموضوع عن شأن داخلي. والسلام عليكم.